You are watching something unfold that has no modern historical precedent. Do not misunderstand this as a routine trade dispute or a familiar hardball negotiation tactic. What is actually happening is far more serious. For the first time in recorded history, a sitting American president has completely lost control of a trade war that he himself started. He is facing a country that has chosen not to negotiate, not to escalate emotionally, but to walk away entirely. That country is Canada. The quiet, polite neighbor to the north that American politicians have taken for granted for decades. And Canada has now triggered the exact nightmare scenario Donald Trump repeatedly promised his supporters would never occur. To understand how we reached this point, we need to look closely at what actually happened. On February 1st, 2025, Donald Trump signed a sweeping set of executive orders imposing a 25% tariff on nearly every category of Canadian goods entering the United States. The energy sector was singled out for special punishment, hit with a 10% levy. To do this, Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law designed for genuine national emergencies, effectively bypassing the very trade agreement he personally negotiated and celebrated during his first term. The official justification was fentanyl allegedly flowing across the northern border. It did not matter that U.S. Customs and Border Protection data clearly showed that virtually none of the fentanyl seized in the United States originates from Canada. That fact was irrelevant. The goal was not accuracy. The goal was dominance. Canada's response was swift and methodical. Ottawa announced $30 billion in retaliatory tariffs aimed directly at politically sensitive American industries. Products like orange juice, peanut butter, wine, household appliances, and motorcycles, goods produced in key swing states, were deliberately targeted. Within 3 weeks, the retaliation escalated to $155 billion. Steel, aluminum, automobiles, beef, pork, and dairy were added. Every economic pressure point Canada could identify was squeezed. Then came a turning point that Washington completely underestimated. Mark Carney became Prime Minister. This is not an ordinary politician. Carney is the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the former governor of the Bank of England, the only person in history to lead the central banks of two different G7 nations. His entire career has been built on understanding leverage, systems, and pressure. In his first speech as Prime Minister designate, Carney stripped Trump's strategy bare. He stated clearly that Canada's retaliatory tariffs would remain in place until Americans show us respect. Not until negotiations conclude. Not until a deal is signed. Until respect is shown. That was not diplomatic language. That was the language of a leader who decided the old rules no longer apply. Trump escalated. By August, he imposed 35% tariffs on Canadian goods that did not explicitly meet USMCA rules of origin. His justification became a rotating list of grievances: retaliation, fentanyl, trade deficits, circular logic that revealed the real strategy: economic coercion. Squeeze Canada until it breaks. What Trump failed to understand is this: Canada is not Mexico. Canada is not China. The economic relationship is structurally different. 63% of Canadian exports to the United States are intermediate inputs: energy, raw materials, agricultural products, and essential components American manufacturers rely on to produce finished goods. When you tariff intermediate inputs, you don't just hurt the exporter, you dismantle your own supply chains. The Wall Street Journal called it the dumbest trade war in history, and this time they were right. On March 10th, the S&P 500 entered correction territory, falling more than 10% from its February peak, wiping out over $4 trillion in market value. In April, after Trump announced new auto tariffs, the market dropped another 10% in just 2 days, the worst week since the COVID crash of 2020. Investors weren't reacting to negotiation tactics. They were reacting to economic self-harm. Trump believed Canada would crack first. 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. Surely they would panic. Instead, Carney boarded a plane to Beijing. On January 16, 2026, Carney became the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit China since 2017. Sitting across from Xi Jinping, he announced a preliminary trade agreement that stunned Washington. China slashed tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 85% to 15%, reopening a $4 billion market. Additional tariffs on canola meal, seafood, and peas were removed, unlocking nearly $3 billion more. In exchange, Canada agreed to allow limited Chinese EV imports, breaking direct alignment with U.S. policy. Trump erupted, threatening 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods. He referred to Carney as governor, not prime minister, after months of publicly suggesting Canada should become the 51st state. This was no longer trade policy. This was an annexation fantasy wrapped in tariffs. Carney called the bluff. At Davos, he declared that the 80-year era of U.S. global economic leadership was over. He dismantled the myth of a rules-based order and warned middle powers that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And then he made it unmistakably clear. He meant it. Canada began signing trade deals across 4 continents. Exports to Europe rose 22%, Africa 18%, Latin America 11%. Not enough to replace the U.S. overnight, but enough to eliminate leverage. Provinces joined in. Ontario pulled U.S. alcohol from shelves. Nova Scotia doubled tolls on American trucks. British Columbia mandated domestic fuel sourcing. Ontario cancelled a massive Starlink contract. Meanwhile, American industries absorbed the shock. Ohio's unemployment rose. Michigan auto plants stalled. Refineries designed for Canadian crude struggled to adapt. Canada accepted the pain. Deliberately, Carney chose short-term damage for long-term sovereignty. Trump faced the opposite math. Courts ruled his tariffs illegal. Appeals failed. He kept them anyway. Canada simplified its strategy, lifting consumer tariffs while maintaining steel, aluminum, and auto duties. They stopped playing Trump's game. This is not negotiation theater. Negotiation requires mutual respect. Trump has repeatedly framed Canada as a dependent entity, not a sovereign equal. Once Canada proved it had options, the leverage reversed. Supply chains don't snap back. Manufacturing doesn't magically return. When trust collapses, structures realign permanently. Trump promised to rebuild American manufacturing. Instead, he pushed it to Mexico and Europe. Canada isn't waiting. They're leaving. And that's the real disaster. Not tariffs, not retaliation, but loss of control. When allies are treated like enemies, they stop acting like partners. Canada showed the world how middle powers survive coercion, diversify, coordinate, endure pain, and call the bluff. And once a bluff is called, power is exposed. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a global realignment, and every country watching is learning the same lesson. Economic dominance is not permanent. It is conditional, and the moment those conditions change, so does the game.